You know, here we are, a room full of very accomplished professionals. What do you tend to see in terms of people and how they think about themselves and how effective they are and how they rank in relationship to others? Any thoughts on that? Have you ever sort of done in any such surveys? Because this is just a very cursory one. Yeah. That is pretty much the summary. 100% of us were in the top 50 percentile. Now, what does that tell about a professional group?
You're engaged.
You're engaged, right? What else does it tell? Let's pump that a little bit. Come, help me out. Think out loud. You're confident, and rightfully so, because you represent the cream of the crop.
We have room to improve.
I'm sorry?
We have room to improve.
Well, that was not evident by the hand raising, but I'd like to accept that as a suggestion. D, as always. There was another comment I didn't hear.
Highly functioning.
Highly functioning. Okay, so you're really operating on a very high level. Confidence level is up, and so on and so on and so on. I hope that it doesn't also mean what we, for instance, find when we address people of the medical group. Hubris. And I'm not seeing that sort of spilling that into the ranks here, because I truly believe I'm the company of some of our best and brightest in the industry. And yet, to reach for what Dee just said a little while ago, it's important, especially when you are sort of in the asymptote of the curve and approximating excellence, that you remain hungry for learning, that you remain hungry and ready to let something die in order to allow something new to grow, without obsoleting yourself in some fashion or form. There is no way that you can really stay on the cutting edge of what it is you do. So I trust that that is the spirit that fills this room, and that's sort of what I would like to speak to. The leaders, the change agents in this room who are not afraid to change themselves and things they believe in. And we have a lot to believe in and a lot to change about what we believe in. And I would like to very sacrilegiously address where we're going, not necessarily as the consensual opinion as to where we're going, but where I think we're going and where we must be going. But let me start a little bit with some history, since I promised you a little bit of that at least. And I would like to ask you, I have no prizes to give out, but as we reflect upon history, which country do you think formed the very first ever ski club in the world? Just sort of think, where did skiing pop up? And who might have had the audacity to actually organize a ski club? Which nation created the first ski club? Any thoughts, any ideas, any hunches? There's Norway, because that's really where the snow was, and this is where skiers skied and so on. It was not Austria, it was not Norway. It was the UK. The top, what caused you to think that?
It should be known. You should know this. I learned it, Horst.
Damn you! Why didn't you know that? All right, quickly moving on from the Dark Ages forward here. In 1904, the National Ski Association of America was formed by Carl Tellefsen. Where do you think that happened? In which state of our nation? Close, but no cigar? No? M? Massachusetts? No? Michigan. Lipscombing. We're also our...
Go Blue.
All right. Who was the first U.S. president to actually take a ski lesson? And by the way, that happened allegedly, and I'm only leaning on data that I collected, happened in 1912. Who was the president at that point?
Teddy Roosevelt.
Oh, who said that? Spot on, Teddy Roosevelt. All right. The 1924, the first Winter Olympic Games were held where? in the world. First Winter Olympic Games. Any thought? If you don't know, yes. It's all about thinking out loud. Bravo. It was in Chamonix, and by the way, only Nordic events were part of that Olympic Games. Isn't that interesting? Because we always associate Olympic Games, or it must have been the whole enchilada, but no. All right. The first downhill race was held where in the US in 1926? Any thoughts? Close? Dartmouth. Dartmouth. Who invented the steel edges? And by the way, I'm that old, I actually remember myself buying packages of steel edges and then routing the skis and embedding them and so on. Do you happen to know who invented the steel edges? Lettner. Who said that? How did you know that?
Because I read Skiing Right, and I remember.
Oh. Outrageous. Just a few more here. Oh yeah, here's a good one. Really jumping forward now. 1941, the first female, US female instructor was certified. Do you happen to know her name? Pacific Northwest? Joy Lucas. Joy Lucas. We lost her only a few years ago, didn't we? A really monumental change. Who remembers what P-TEX was? Most of us who really don't want to date ourselves, I say I admit I know it, the plastic little candles that we dripped into the holes and so on. When did Aspen open? Any thoughts? Aspen? When might it have happened? I mean, the town of Aspen existed for quite some time, but the actual ski town and ski corporation, Aspen, any thoughts? 46, who said that? Carol, and her research is as accurate as ever. Yes. Am I embarrassing you yet? Okay, here's a good one. 1948, Gretchen Fraser competed and won in the Olympics, silver and combined. What was her even superior achievement? She was the first US athlete to win and medal, period, male or female. So Gretchen Fraser really sort of began to bring home the bacon. Isn't that neat? Here a question. Do any of you remember what mambo was? Mambo? Somebody describe. What was mambo? Show me. What was mambo?
Split rotation.
Split rotation.
We used to go by that.
Could you show me that first?
No, I can't.
No, you can't.
Like that.
You rather say, here's another one before we move on with things. Who invented stretch pants? Willie Bogner, and made millions from it. Let me see whether there's anything else. Oh, well, here's somebody that we need to mention. In 1958, somebody invented GLM. Who was that? GLM. Really noteworthy. As a matter of fact, I believe we abandoned that system all too early before exploring it fully. Sad but true. When was PSIA formed? 61 and where?
In Whitefish, Montana.
You knew that. All right. Well, let's, and one more thing, because we were there, or some of us were there. The first National Academy was Ski Instructors Academy was in 1973, and it was held where? Who said that? Wonderful. Were you part of it? No, you look way too young. Way too young. You weren't even a glint in somebody's eye yet. All right. Well, let me move on into something else. When I sort of spoke about, where I truly believe we're going, I would like to preface whatever I will say here by sharing something that I encountered by meeting somebody in this room. And I hope, Larry, wherever you are, if you don't mind my saying what I'm mentioning. There is Larry. Do you mind if I go on? Yeah. Because somehow I really think it was the essence of what I would like to address. We shared a beer, we had a wonderful conversation about this and that, and he shared with me how his life was really at a very severe omega point. Things happened that fundamentally will change the way he is conducting his life, the priorities by which he has operated, and so on and so on. And we really had a connection that I would call a high-quality connection. It so turns out that he, years and years ago, also was generous enough to give me a ride to the airport. But all I wish to sort of say is the connection you and I built in that half hour that we perhaps sat together, I would like to consider core to what I would like to speak about. Creating connections in that space between instructor and guest that is not of transactional nature, but transformational nature. And when you really strike that kind of a relationship, nothing that happens in the space that you create will be the same or is comparable to anything that you've done before or after. It's unique, it's special, it is deep, it's profound. And it creates what probably many of you have in your life, and lucky you if you do, and shame on you if you don't, lifelong friendships with clients who moved on from just being dedicated guests and students to becoming meaningful friends. So this sort of as a little prelude to what I really would like to address. We've truly covered a lot of ground. And I have to say, just from where I sit, which is a very limited perspective, in the last 2 or 3 years, thanks to some of the very special people in our ranks, Rob and others, Ellen, and so on, we've really begun moving in a direction that will set us apart from where we've been in very significant ways. Superficially not, but fundamentally and characteristically yes. That's what I would like to address as we spend some time here. You know, from the benign to the absurd, that journey has happened in a nanosecond. And my question is, has what we do and how we frame ourselves, how we train ourselves, how we select and deselect ourselves, has that part of the equation kept pace? In my own constantly impatient way, I would say no. Have we made inroads? Yes. Have we gone fast enough? No. And I truly believe that in this day and age, in this conceptual age, in this age of abundance, people look for a value proposition that goes beyond the transactional nature of what it is that we can offer them. And how do we do that? How do we prepare ourselves for that? We can't just shake it out of our sleeve because authenticity is difficult to buy. So what I would really like to sort of address is, yes, we've made progress, but perhaps the progress has not necessarily been what we should be looking for and what we are looking for. Because we're getting increasing number of reports from guests who simply say, I don't understand what my instructor is talking about. Moreover, if and when I do, I have no way of connecting with it in a physiological manner. And, you know, however mentally, physically, or emotionally you feel pretzeled by what it is you sometimes hear others say in a clinic, in a lesson, and so on, it is sometimes disparaging to think that our progress, the very progress we've made, by taking deep dives into the substance of what our sport is, we've also created an inadvertent obstacle. And we need to somehow begin to address that. How did that happen? What biases has it built that are so difficult to overcome? Because when we speak now of experiential education, people say, well, that's been around for 50 years, and you're right. But when we look at what's being done on the slopes, it's not practiced. Moreover, when you engage people about, so what is it to you? What is the structure of it? People go blank. So I think we have work to do. We have an opportunity here to really reinvent ourselves in meaningful ways, and I hope that what I say today will not be as injurious as it will be helpful to move ourselves and accelerate the movement in the direction that we're talking about. Because when you look at these skiers, this is just last year, they fundamentally look different only in terms of clothing. In terms of movement, in terms of how they show up, how they move themselves down the hill, very little has changed. Very little has changed. From a feeling perspective, you probably feel that turns happen more readily because they are in modern equipment. And the connection with the skis is probably much more solid because boots have helped that. But from a fundamental performance characteristic, they are doing the kind of turns that are distinct and different from these kind, that probably instructors before going to work have carved into the patterns now. So what has been our achievement then? We clung to certain emphases that turned out to be dead ends, or it's become a binary discussion in the international scene right now. Do we carve? Do we not carve? What do we emphasize? Should we square the hip? Should we counter the hip? And so on and so on. And I, for one, have to say, those conversations are interesting, and pardon my finishing that sentence by saying, but they're irrelevant. Because the diversity of the physiques that engage and mindsets that engage in skiing, the execution will always look different. It will look different when the light changes, when the snow changes. People's abilities and physiques will respond differently to certain situations. Now, is it fun to do movement analysis and to see this? By all means. Is it valuable? Yes, on an intellectual level. But I would like to really explore it on a practical, on an application level. This is really functionally what we need to be capable and skillful to engage with. Is that a fair assessment? Whatever we put in subtitle here, but growth and learning, socializing and belonging. Many of the people who come to lessons say, that is really important. Me being part of a lesson, being in company of other people, like-minded, like-spirited people. This is use for me. Creativity, innovation, health and recreation, arts and entertainment. What in the world does that have to do with instructor function? Yes, we're responsible to create the symphonies that express themselves in bodily movement then on the slope. A poetic way of looking at it? Yeah, and believe me, impactful when you speak of symphonies rather than carving a turn. Because the impact, the participation capability on the part of the student is on a whole different level. And so on. So if we truly consider our function to require a systems approach, we must not get hung up in one of the many skill sets and domains in which we function. And I, for one, think we have been hung up in that for a long, long time. I even talk about the lost years, but I won't go there any further. This is traditionally what we've asked ourselves. What do we do and how do we do it? The fundamental additional questions, who does it and why do we do it, need to be explored far more in order to perhaps even reframe our mission statement. And by the way, PSIA's mission statement is what?
Inspire lifelong passion for the mountain experience.
Say it louder.
Inspire lifelong passion for the mountain experience.
In my way of isn't it amazing? We have 30% in the top 10%, and we don't remember our mission statement. Do you think that's an important thing? I, for one, do believe it is. And it also somehow characterizes what we're really talking about. Because this, our standing one, is actually a myopic mission statement. It's conceived from our mindset, rather than saying something to the extent of maximizing the experience of our guests, or optimizing it, however you want to say that. I'm not trying to wordsmith here, but that is guest focus. The rest is not. Subtle difference? No, I think it's expressive of why we've been hung up in where we've been for so long, so hard, so deeply. And we need to somehow loosen those shackles. We have to break that piece by piece by allowing ourselves to rethink, recalibrate in the way we approach things here. And by the way, because of the huge diversity of students and instructors, and I really mean and instructors, any algorithmic presentation of a progression, of a sequence of exercises and so on, cannot achieve the transformational change that I believe we need to expose ourselves to. If we don't, I think we'll see the consequences in terms of atrophying participation, and so on and so on. And we don't have necessarily a very proud percentage participation rate at our beginner level, or return rate rather. So the algorithmic methodology that we've been operating for so long, we're beginning to break free, thanks to the team and its wonderful leadership here, and yet it has not really been institutionalized yet. And again, Rob and Ellen are working so hard in doing that by rewriting our materials, and I really tip my hat to them. I will not linger with this, but one of the many, many things we need to understand in order to allow ourselves to reframe our function and our role in it is the understanding between closed skills and open skills. How many of you say you have a working understanding of the differentiation and the implications in terms of your teaching? I see one hand, one shy. I know Laurie is probably here. She's just not wanting to lose her grip on the beard. And by the way, when I sort of point at this only as being one of many, many mile markers, milestones, that we really need to understand in order to allow us help usher us along the path of change, what is the fundamental significance of the difference between open and closed skill sets? Quickly.
The environment.
Implications on instructors, though.
Flexibility.
That's what I would like to talk about as we move on here, and hopefully we'll also have some time to discuss later on in the evening. This fundamentally sort of, I'm a visual thinker, this somehow captures how we've been operating ever since the Albert times of the years. We have a sharp focus, a technique that has an embedded sequence, and the sequences are further defined in great detail. What we're creating is an inevitable environment in which the student is rendered to passive learning. He or she receives the recipe, is encouraged to aim for certain things, and conformance is the fundamental desire. Conformance, which in the context of learning is really a divergent environment, not a convergent one, is a contradiction, it's an oxymoron from a practical and from a theoretical point of view. And I've tried to get Ron to speak about that ever since he wrote in a 32-degree article what I so heartily embraced. Technique is not methodology. Technique as we now hold it, when we, for instance, put ourselves through movement analysis and so on, is nothing other than a retro-engineering of what we can discover by looking with sharp focus at the sport. We reverse engineer skiing, essentially. And the assumption that because we now can do that by spitting details of that reverse engineered picture that we created out back to the student will generate behavioral change is simply naive. And we need to somehow re-educate ourselves to the point that when we think of ourselves as professionals, we need to also understand people always learn, no matter what, under the most dire situations, with the worst instruction, they will always learn. So we can't necessarily validate what we do by virtue of looking at results emerging. We need to understand the causal relationship between what we do and what the effect is. We need to be going to the second level of analysis if we truly want to substantiate what we do in our profession. And I begin to see that happen. And I celebrate that with all my heart. It has not happened in 20 years. I won't even talk any here. When we deal with behavior on the level of behavior, we will always have some impact. We may or may not have some impact. Only if we begin to look beyond of what actually causes the behavior can we be mindfully and systematically invested in creating an environment in which certain things will or promise to occur. So we need to study again our function from a systems point of view. I keep repeating that because it's so important. And we can't lose ourselves in just remembering pet peeves or what seemed to work in the last lesson and so on. We need to be exquisite customizing agents in assessing the situation, systems analysis, well beyond movement analysis. Because again, movement analysis is only the telltale of how the system responds to stimuli that it's being fed. Am I making any sense there? So, how do we deal with this? And what do we inadvertently, not by design, not by desire, not by intent, cause when we only stay above the waterline, so to say? And here is what we learn from research that is being done about people who live and operate and function and perform in a converging learning environment. Performance anxiety, even if it doesn't manifest with sweaty foreheads and so on, if I'm on the line to live up to the expectations of my teacher, that creates tension in my body, that causes cortisol effect. I mean to say, it is not just something that I mentally experience, but my body then will begin to manifest it. And it has a very, very powerful effect on it. Limited capacity simply speaks to the competition when I live in a learning environment in which I'm trying to conform to somebody's instruction, and what competes with the should, what I should do, with what is actually happening. I mean to say, my perception of what's actually happening will have first priority, inevitably, because of the anxiety that I bring into performance. So, I need to realize that whenever I issue shoulds or instructional tidbits, I need to be very careful as to what it is, how much it is, and when I insert it. Because that competition will always be there. In our mind, our processing mind has only a limited capacity to process information. And incoming information that is not should information always has priority. Always. Always. This is essentially what our classic model accomplishes. We lead the professionals, study the experience, study it more, and study it again, dissect it, fragment it, shine a light on every aspect of it. We synthesize it, we calibrate it, we categorize it, and then through the lens of having done that, the instructor then spits instruction out to the student. Sanitized. The experience is stolen from it. So what we need to understand is experiential learning needs the collision of raw data and the system that is attempting to conform to the challenges at hand. That does not mean that the instructor becomes meaningless or superfluous, rather the opposite. It just means that the role begins to really change very significantly. And I can't emphasize enough of this here. And whenever I visit at the bottom of the ski hill, classes that are just ending, especially beginner classes, and I interview people very informally, because I don't want to accost them and make it anything formal, which then would probably give them a little rise, and they will begin to only say things that seem right. You always talk about feeling helpless, inadequate, having accomplished some things, but man, oh man, so many things are elusive in the process of learning. So there is a relation, but also an underlying dismissal of the person, the persona, him or herself. Resist the temptation to sanitize skiing to the level that we've done. And I would like to take the rest of the time to make some suggestion as to what form that may take and what we could do, because when I start the lesson, whether it's at the university or our subsidiaries in Bangkok or Frankfurt or wherever it is, every time I start a lesson, it's alchemy. It's the intersection and the interface between whoever is there interacting with not only me, but also the topic. And my first and primary responsibility is to create open space in which, not because of obligation, but because of curiosity that I hopefully am able to generate, we all sort of surround the event, look at it curiously, experiment our way into it, into the fabric of what it is, and that is creating then the serotonin effect, learning addiction. Because as we figure things out ourselves, being shepherded in the direction, but not being given the answer, we create chemical responses that are opposite from the cortisol effect. And that requires teachers to redefine themselves, because we no longer are the center of attention, or we're no longer the keepers of the knowledge. We're the midwives of all that happening. So we need to know, or taking the analogy of a sheepdog, we need to know when to move the herd, because the grass is getting thin, or moving them away from danger, if that's what the issue is, and so on. So our role becomes much more a collaborative role with the process and the guest. Hence, the way I've sort of looked at guest-centered teaching and experience-driven learning, guest-centeredness is my service model. This is what I hold as being imperative. The guest is centered to what I do, and my responsibility is to enhance his or her experience to the utmost. When I take just one of the many functions that we fulfill, and it happens to be learning or performance management, then I go to EDL, experience-driven learning. And that is a subset, that is supportive of the guest-centered orientation, but guest-centered itself does no longer express it, address it, or really deal with it in any effective way. So resist the temptation to make it straight by simply following algorithms that you learned all the time. Every lesson is an experiment. Alchemy is my way of thinking of it. This is the alternative. And here I mentioned already some of the ingredients that need to be part of the environment that I build. One is the challenge, because we are a goal-oriented individual. Our species is very oriented towards achieving certain things, moving from here to there, achieving certain things, but at the same time creating an open space around that. So by stating the challenge, I don't create this, but I create that. And that is a way of framing the challenge in a different and distinct way. I will address the what to do, outcome-oriented instruction, not how to do it. Big, big, big difference. Many people will say, well, that's just wishful thinking. How can you expect a student to know how to do this? There's so many innate, embedded capabilities that people come with. that we don't have to rely as heavily as we currently do in giving instruction down to the operational detail. And remember again, serotonin effect. When the eureka kicks in because somebody figured something out, I told them what to do, and I really VAKE'd it to death. So they really see it, hear it, feel it, and then do it. The learning is just exponential. Rather than having to conform, which oftentimes also goes hand in hand with failure. So the instructor becomes a designer, collaborator, cheerleader. More recently, I've read many articles and saw 2 exhibits of snow design that allegedly helps the learning process. So far, I've seen very few that actually accomplish that, even though they're very costly to install. So we have to really give that some thought as to what those contours need to be and what the instructional process needs to be in order to make that happen. Because it's a melange that goes beyond the simplistic of, now let's just play here. As we sort of go through here, building the learning community tells me also that the current bias of private lessons, one-on-one, the fewer the better, will be most effective, is erroneous. Small groups, learning communities are far more impactful than individual lessons. No matter what the public bias is, that's just what it is. And research substantiates that left and right. So how do we embrace that? How do we create, if we're really capable of that, how do we create the learning community, the open space, the interaction among students being more important than the interaction between myself and the students? And again, please don't read that as I no longer matter. I matter a whole lot, because I need to know when, how, where to move the community at any given time. It takes a much more customized investment of energy and thought. This is most important also. Soft focus. In the context of what we're talking about, even if it's still fuzzy, what might soft focus mean? Just think out loud. What might soft focus mean? Real-time question. I'm going to put you in such a passive.
Like when we use soft focus and movement analysis, we're not looking for a very specific movement. Just how do things look on a general concept?
Beautifully said. Were you able to hear that? I mean, wonderfully said. Could you say it one more time? Because some of our colleagues listening to that.
I was
Stand up so you radiate, but
question. When we talk about soft focus and movement analysis, we're not looking intensely at a specific movement so much as how does everything look overall, kind of clearly a learning perspective.
so we're starting with intent, right? VAKE it, really important. By the way, do you understand what I mean when I say VAKE it? Yeah, make it real in terms of our senses. Soft focus then means once my intent is clear, then I need to see the whole picture as a whole, because that's what I'm beginning to immerse myself into. That's why skiing is labeled an open skill sport. I must see the whole in order to be able to integrate myself into what it is that I'm doing. That's the soft focus emphasis, and elegantly interpreted. Thank you very much, sir. I hope I can afford you. The other, in that context, and again, I would really appreciate some thinking out loud. In that context, what is the value and merit of autonomy? What kind of autonomy do we want the student to exercise?
To be their own best teacher.
Start to
connect.
connect, right? And it's really enabled by the autonomy that we render to them. It could be either temporal autonomy, when they wish to do it, right? Intensity autonomy, how much of it to do it, where to do it, and with whom to do it. Because oftentimes, real starbursts will go off if and when people begin to collaborate. Very reminiscent of what happened in the Greek experiment way back when Jean Vionnet and Georges Schubert collaborated at the Grenoble University, and we saw students interact with each other, and in so doing, generated progressions that had surges of exponential growth, simply because they talked to each other about what they were experiencing. Not the student feeding them things, but guiding them, providing the right terrain, the right traffic circumstances, the right energy environment, because energy and intensity is a very important part of the learning process. And whoosh, it was just unbelievable. Sort of reminiscent of George Patton say, you would be surprised what soldiers can do if you tell them what to do and then get out of their way. You know, and nobody can question Patton's success in the Second World War. So, this is really what we need to realize. Even though this is the reality that we have diagnosed to death, we know inside and out, and we've created prescriptions around it. It is seen and interpreted, perceived by every single player that is part of whatever group, learning group you compose. The experience of that will be different. So if that is something that you can accept intellectually, what's that compel you to do as an instructor? First and foremost, what immediately is the action item that springs from that insight? You have to do what?
Get out of the way today.
Get out of the way for sure, right? To really allow that to happen, because they will initially hesitate to fill that space. You know, because you create an open. The expectation is that you fill the space. And I was trained as a teacher to fill the space with meaningful information. So now to create an open space and walk away from it, take some patience, take some gall, take some redefining what's the importance of my presence. And when I get these kind of conversations going, that is when a lesson just feels like a... And you all know, because you've had these experiences. People are firing on all cylinders. There's excitement in the air. People exchange insights and recommendations. And even sometimes I listen to some of the recommendations and, oh no, don't say that. It doesn't even matter if the directions they come up with for each other are not necessarily correct as defined by my interpretation of this. Get out of the way. Resist the temptation to fix it. And the more you trust, and that is the paradoxical thing, and sometimes becomes a dilemma. Because I often find myself, I don't trust the student enough. And that is what's keeping them from proceeding, not because they can't. Because when I no longer trust, they feel that. They feel that in my proximity that I choose to be to them, in the tone of my voice, what I say, how I say it, and so on and so on and so on. When we begin to think of teaching on that level, it's no longer just a science, even though that may be the first hump we need to climb over. Then it becomes an art form. And when we do that, we will be valuable in any industry, anywhere, anytime. Because that kind of high-level connection that we as instructors are so capable of creating is invaluable in any industry right now. I'm a piece of evidence. When people ask me, how did you learn that? I said, I learned it in my interaction with ski students. And then they look at me aghast. That couldn't possibly be true. And yet it is. But I had to step away. I had to give up filling the space that I was so trained to fill with all sorts of stuff that I now consider garbage. How many of you remember Tim Galway? And inner skiing never really made it because of Krugel not being very incapable of bringing it to the same level as Tim Galway brought things. And therefore it died. And many people, even some of my very revered colleagues nowadays say, that was a fluke. In a game was a fluke. But remember, some of you may be old enough to remember the interview on ABC, and I gave that example many times, and I'm still sort of experiencing goose pimples when I remember it. ABC had assembled, having heard about Tim Galway, the guru of tennis, had assembled an inner city group of people who were totally unathletic, totally incapable of doing much more than walking to and from the grocery store buying Twinkies. Deliberately tried to set him up to fail in that particular experiment, in which he was asked, so show us your magic, you have an hour. And he did. And Molly was probably the most morbidly obese person in the group. Had sneakers with no cushions in the sole at all, had worn away. You know, she was not a very wealthy person. She wore a muumuu because she couldn't buy clothing that she could fit into. And there she was, in 1 hour, returning baseline shots with a crack. And reverse backhand volleys over the net in 1 hour. At no point was she given instruction other than what to do, not how to do it. So this is just additional evidence for those of us who are skeptics in this room, and it's so understandable that you're skeptical because we've lived a different narrative for so long. And by the way, based on results so successfully. But forgetting, people always learn. And we can't evaluate the merit of our contribution by whether or not they learned alone. Because so much of it happens anyway. As a matter of fact, I venture to say, and many of those who I've been in correspondence with, in contact with for many years now, I say the most important things in any job, but also in skiing or snowboarding, can't be taught, but they can be learned. Hence, the importance of instructors as designers of learning environments in which the chances of certain things being learned that are not teachable happen. So we need to really orient ourselves. What are those unteachable dimensions of it, the perceptual, the time and space dimensions that are so critical to the open skill sport dimensions of skiing and boarding, and then have the humility to attend to those things that you know you can teach, and the rest of it become a designer for the environment in which other things can or are likely to happen. That would be a very worthwhile assignment for some of us, wouldn't it? To distinguish between the teachables and the learnables. We've never attempted to do that. This is pretty self-explanatory. This is somehow where we've, the more classic skiing that I certainly was a product of hung out here. Then we began to ooze into here, and now especially this, the last generation and the new generation of thinking in our team and our PSIA inner circle is definitely coming into the green, which is just so wonderful to hear. Active learning has everything to do with these kind of things. Speaking, doing, feeling, teaching, playing, reflecting. This, not that. I will be quick with that because some of you are getting heavy eyelids, so I want to be respectful of that. Otherwise, I would not treat the open space very well. Very, very briefly, when we speak of error detection and error correction, we're fundamentally hanging out on the left-hand side of this particular spectrum here. And I refer to it in my colleagues at University of Michigan who've done research around that. Kim Cameron and Bob Quinn refer to that as the deficit gap. Deficit gap in the context of Dweck's work on mindset is not just a negligible thing. The more I hang out in looking at problems, the more will problems occur. The more I hang out in the space that we now call the opportunity gap, on this end, on the positive deviant side, the fewer errors will occur, or the more errors will self-correct. Isn't that interesting? It's a very, initially, I was brought up in a very Teutonic way. Right, wrong, black, white, and so on and so on. I didn't believe this shit for a moment. Until I saw the research and I saw the evidence, because it was also clinical research, so I saw the behaviors change as a result of that. So by shifting our emphasis from movement analysis catering to catching errors and fixing errors to moving to the opportunity gap in becoming stellar in describing the what of what we want to accomplish will diminish the need to attend to error correction. And I want you to at least experiment with that before you dismiss it. And you'll be surprised what you find. And by the way, this here requires positive deviance on our part. And deviant is usually associated with what? When we hear the word deviant, what do we? Negative, bad, right? I deliberately want you to think of positive deviance as that. And we have to change terminology in order to put a hook into that. If I just said, be more positive, that wouldn't be it. If this room leaves here with positive deviance in mind, lots of things will change that is different in both methodology and result. I promise you. This, by the way, happens when we hang out in that opportunity gap, in that possibility gap, the heliotropic effect. Helio describes what? Sun, tropic, tropos, temperature, right? Every organism in our universe that we know of seeks warmth, heat, and the positive. And the more we are able to live that, not just thinking, but live it in word and action and attitude, the more will we create this here, the opportunity gap here. Which, by the way, when I heard for the first time our new CEO speak yesterday, he is that in spades, don't you think?
Absolutely.
And this is a multiplier. This is something you can bet your money on. In the business world, we measure that now in the billions of dollars. If our culture work with organizations is able to achieve the shift from being micromanaging and error correcting and TQM oriented to possibility gap kind of cultures, the results show up within 1-2 years, and they just keep going because it's self-perpetuating, it's contagious. It becomes self-perpetuating after a while. So as you interact with your students, your colleagues, and so on, what forms could that take? Take that home as an exercise. And by the way, as I look into the crowd, rightfully some of you are tired because you worked hard on the slope. But do you know what your emotional weight is as it radiates from your face? It ain't that. What's the implication of that? It works in the reverse too. When you go out on the slope, getting character, much like Disney people, employees do before they surface and become the character they need to be for the day. Look yourself in the mirror. What is your neutral facial expression? What is your neutral demeanor with which you radiate all sorts of profound messages to others? Do you know your emotional weight is a wonderful quote coined by Susan Scott, the writer of a wonderful book. If you haven't read it, you should. Fierce Conversations. Please pick it up if you haven't already. Are you aware of your emotional weight? Meaning, how does a person, a group, a place feel different from before you met and engaged with that person, that group, or that space? Are you a neutral impact? And if you think you're neutral, you're fantasizing. Nobody ever leaves an encounter neutral. You're either elevated or you're depressing. Make it your responsibility to elevate it, and you will become a multiplier. will not spend much time here, other than to say, engagement matters not only with our guests and clients. And when you're engaged with a student, and the student is engaged with you, how do you know that? Quickly, some descriptors.
They're participating.
They're participating, what else? They might even choose to look at you through the goggles and whatever they have to look in order to make that connection. How else do you know? Smile, you know, many times we're sort of mummified, but sometimes just
Tone of voice.
Asking questions.
they're asking questions, they're offering suggestions, insights, and so on and so on. But the energy is one that is very, very palpable. And when we sort of took that diagnosis to the next level, your blood pressure tends to set in, right? Your pupils tend to dilate. Unfortunately, we don't see much of that because we usually wear eyeglasses or goggles and so on. And our body temperature is elevated. Consider the same effect of you as an employee in the organization that you work for or with. Fully engaged? And if yes, what are the conditions that create for a high quality connection between yourself and your employer? What is the transactional agreement between yourself and employer? Answer that question, but that's not the important one to feel fully engaged. What are the implicit assumptions about us working for somebody else? Those will answer whether or not you're engaged or not. We'll talk about that very briefly later on if we have a smaller group, and we'll talk a little bit more about EDL. These are just data about guest and employee engagement. The multiplier effect of that cannot be even described. Nationally, by Towers Perrin, we have a $3 billion loss per year because under engagement of people who work for organizations. Devastating news. So what do you do as a ski school director, as a supervisor, as a trainer, in order to mitigate that, to create the opposite of that? Also detail that I don't want to bother you with, but the ratio with which we need to mix positive and corrective is approximately 6-to-1. So if we're truly hanging out in the opportunity gap with our classes and our guests, and we have 6 times more encouragement than one thing that may say, I want to amplify this or that a little bit more, then we're on the right track, and so on. Or asking questions, 1-to-1. Our industry would be totally different if we truly can accomplish this. We would radiate an invitation to the public, even to tier 1, to tier 3 customers who have never even thought of coming into skiing and boarding. If we begin to be known as an industry that radiates those kind of qualities. But if we're defined by what I see in the faces here, we're not there yet. And I emphasize the word yet, because I believe that you can and will do it. So let's summarize. Kolb defines it very simply and very straightforwardly. Do you tend to agree? Yep, let me read it out loud for those that experiences serve as the source of learning. Simple enough? Can you agree with that?
Yes.
Role of instructor: designs and manages the space in which the development of physical skills, emotional resilience, mental agility, and social capital grow. Big words, but systems approach to it. And you design the space, you hold the space, and that holding the space is very, very important. Like right now, I'm grateful for being able to hold our space even though you're tired, because about 90% of you are actually paying attention, which is wonderful, which is marvelous. And I'm very grateful for that. This is not a critique of the 10% that I don't believe are with me at this point. It's not just saying I'm obviously not capable enough to engage the rest of you as well. Shame on me, and I need to work on that. But that is really the role of the instructor. The role of the student, help create the collaborative environment in which risk-taking, experimentation, play, and reflection fosters radical engagement, which is much more in tune with what I would like to see our professional mission to be than what it currently is. Because our current statement is well-intentioned, but it projects our wish out there rather than optimizing who it is that pays the money to engage with us. And the EDL methodology, this is what we will talk about a little bit later when we have people who are still interested in digging a little bit into that. But I very much understand that some of you will wave goodbye to that. If we sort of track our history, sort of coming to the bookend of my talk with you here, if we track time in terms of teaching style, here is pretty much the path along which we have gone. Pretty self-explanatory, isn't it? In terms of methodological framing, this is what we've seen over the years. And we're working on the fourth, which will then drive the increasing shared responsibility between student and teacher and active learning environment. That becomes our goal, and so on. And let me finish with that. John Carter is a very well-renowned Harvard business professor who wrote the preeminent change model. You know, how do organizations change, detailing every step on the way, and so on. And because it was a very academic book, he thought he would write a book that everyone understands. So he wrote the book, Our Iceberg is Melting, which could be our story, could it not? And the story is populated, as always, by a rebel rouser, Fred. Could be also Frida or Carol. Just mentioning names arbitrarily. Who somehow say something that the rest of them just can't relate with. And of course, there are some who sort of stand by and sort of are interested and tell me more and so on. There are those. And then there is Buddy, who always follows no-no. And I think we all know no-nos in our environments. And they're always there. And they're always an impediment. And yet they are part of the system that we need to deal with. And so Carter tells the story about their iceberg indeed was melting. Fred noticed it, began to tell the story to others who were in deep denial initially. Some began to conform and ask interesting questions. Some even wanted to see the evidence of it. Until finally, the iceberg actually had to be abandoned and a new iceberg had to be found. So I hope that we're not adrift with our iceberg that we're riding on, but that we can lean on a wonderful leadership group that has crystallized in our organization that gives me incredible hope. It's nourishing, really, the attitude that I've seen recently. And I hope that the tidbits of what is possible, looking at the opportunity gap and what may fill it, if you choose to engage with it, could bring us. This will not be an easy journey, because the change will require many things to be set aside that we currently define ourselves by. But we will also recognize many things that we will need to carry forward, because they're foundational, and they're good, they're working, and we need to build on them. And that tension will prevail over a while. So be both patient and be persistent to draw your leaders into the process, so we all can begin to write our own script, because so far, most of our script was written by equipment and ski technology, and we're better than that. Good night.